Hello! We're so glad to have you back for our latest session of On Book, the Old Globe's Shakespeare Reading Group. My name is Danielle Mages Amato. I'm the literary manager and dramaturg at the Globe, and I want to welcome you all to the conversation today. Sorry we started a few minutes late. John, our guest, and I were having a few technical difficulties, which I think were entirely my fault. But here we are, live as usual. So today we're going to be continuing our discussion of the Taming of the Shrew. I've started posting some discussion questions in the group, focusing on kind of the first two acts of the play, which we've set as our unofficial reading goal for the week. And we'll feel our way through. We'll see if discussion questions in that format work for everybody. So check those out. See if you want to participate in that way. And I'll continue posting those over the next few days. So in our last session, we welcomed director Shauna Cooper to take some questions about the play. I'm really pleased to say that she will be joining us again at the end of our discussion of Shrew to talk about the ending of the play, so you don't want to miss that conversation. Today, I'm very happy to welcome actor John Tufts. Let me see if I can get him onto the screen. Yeah, it's working. Hello, John. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
John is a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University. He spent more than a decade in the company of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where he has acted in more than 20 of Shakespeare's plays, including, not surprisingly, The Taming of the Shrew. He's also performed in several shows at Chicago Shakespeare Festival, including taking the role of Henry V. Yes, which is actually the next play we'll be discussing in this group, which is why I bring it up.
Oh,
and he is the author of a book called Fat Rascals, Dining at Shakespeare's Table. So hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit. I want to encourage you guys while we are talking, please feel free to leave your questions and comments in the chat. I will happily take those and we'll pull them on screen and we'll have John answer those questions. So I think we're going to start by asking, why Shakespeare? What made Shakespeare a playwright you wanted to devote a big chunk of your career to in this modern day and age?
I started getting interested in Shakespeare when I was in middle school. I would say probably like 12 or 13. And my older brother was reading, we're not in a theater, so I can say it. My older brother was reading Macbeth, and he had this big leather-bound, kind of gilded-edged volume of Shakespeare that was given to him by my grandfather. And it was like onion skin pages and really, Shakespeare-y. And I, as my brother was reading Macbeth for high school, I would like flip through it, and I thought it was cool that there were witches and that heads got chopped off and things like that. And I was so into it. And but I didn't understand it. I understood some of the witches things, and then we watched the Orson Welles. My brother and I watched the Orson Welles Macbeth and the Roman Polanski Macbeth. And those two films are so wildly different, but I was so into it. I just couldn't. They were so dark and moody and violent, and I just thought that was so cool. That was my real first exposure to Shakespeare, and I was pretty much hooked from then on. And then in middle school, in 8th grade, I did a production of Much Ado, where I was cast as a guy in the watch. It was like a high school production, but they needed some extra people in it, and so I was one of the guys in the watch. And then two of the other guys in the watch dropped out because they wanted to play football or something, I don't know. And so they were trying to find other people to rope in to play the watch, and I said, well, I'll do it. I'll play those guys as well. And so I played sort of like three guys, like it was one crazy dude. And I just,
it was a very aggressive one-man watch.
Right. Yeah. The one-man watch, which played like gangbusters to people who had no idea what was going on. And so that was just something that I really wanted to keep doing. And Shakespeare has always been this thing that I go back to. It's sort of the roots of everything. When I graduated from Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie is a wonderful school, but it's very commercially oriented. Kids go to New York or Los Angeles. They're in television or they're doing Broadway. And I really wanted to be a part of a company. And those things don't exist in the way that I had in my imagination, except in just a few places. And so I was really lucky and joined the Oregon Shakespeare Festival's company at that time, and then was there for 12 years.
Wow. I mean, how many times, since we're talking about Taming of the Shrew specifically, how many times would you guesstimate you've seen Taming of the Shrew or been in Taming of the Shrew?
Well, I've only been in one production of Taming of the Shrew, but we performed it 120 times, so I guess a lot. Uh, the Yeah, we performed it over 8 months or 9 months. I have seen Taming of the Shrew, I would say easily 8, 9 times. The first production of it that I ever saw was with the Lake Tahoe Shakespeare Festival, I think, or Lake Tahoe Shakespeare Company or something. I want to say in maybe 96, 97, and my dad took me, and I had no idea how the play began with the Christopher Sly stuff, and so there were these two people who were kind of like riffing with the audience, and I thought, my God, those people are rude. And then it turned out that they were part of the show, and it was all part of the Christopher Sly stuff, and I had no idea that that was happening. It totally threw me, and it was fantastic. And I saw that, a wonderful production at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival that a woman named Kate Buckley directed that knocked my socks off, that played with time and was really visceral. Yeah, I've seen so many productions of it, and each one is very different and wrestles with how to treat that play in a modern context differently.
Since a lot of people in the group are reading the play for the first time, do you have a memory at all of reading or encountering the play for the first time? And has your experience or opinion of it changed over the years, seeing it and being in it?
Well, the time that I was in it, I played Tranio, and Tranio, I remember being really excited to play Tranio because in the versions that I had seen, in the different productions that I had seen, Tranio was really funny, and there were good twists at the end, and with the pedant, and I thought, oh, I'm excited to do those twists. And then as I started reading it, I was like, wait, I thought this was funny. How am I going to make this funny? The jokes, I didn't get them, and they there were whole sections, passages that where I was like, oh no, I am the wrong person for this because I don't know how to make this funny. And and so then I did what I always do, which is I just read it over and over again. I probably read it 30, 40 times before that first rehearsal. And then things started to click, and I started to go, oh, I see how he's in disguise right now, and maybe we can play with disguise in a funny way. Maybe we can go really far with how that disguise is. Maybe we can treat it really absurdly. Um, and and then the director of that was a man named David Ivers, who runs South Coast Rep, kind of near San Diego, and he had some fantastic ideas about how to take it even further and be even more extreme with the character. And so that kind of stuff opened huge doors in terms of what was allowed comically. So my first impression reading through it was, oh, this is so much flatter than I remember it when I would see it in performance. It's a play that I think requires being read out loud. It's a play that, for me at least, it requires being read out loud in order to lift the jokes off of the page, because on the page it's hard to make sense of those jokes.
Yeah, it's something that we talked about in our conversation with Shauna Cooper about how she didn't understand the play till she got in rehearsal with it and discovered the clowning aspects of it.
Right.
And I'm curious about characters. I wonder if you could speak a little bit, like, would you consider when you are cast as Tranio, is it a clowning role, or have you played a lot of clowns in Shakespeare's plays? And what do you think the role of clowning is in a play like Shrew?
Well, I have played a lot of clowns. Mostly, I sort of joke that what I play is clowns and kings, and so it's like I do roles like Tranio, and then the next year I'll do a role like Henry V, and so it's always weird, I think, for casting directors to go, I don't know, what are you? But that's sort of what I do. I think that I don't consider Tranio a clown in the way that I consider Biondello a clown. I think Biondello is a classic clown. Which is to say, he might not be aware of his own comedy. His comedy is sort of his comedy is occasionally in wordplay, but a lot of it is in kind of situational gags. Whereas Tranio is trying to be one step ahead, and so I guess he's in that sense I would call him more of a fool, which is somebody who is aware of the situation and then and tries to play out that situation for his own benefit and for others' benefit, as opposed to Biondello, who's, I would say, a very strict clown in the
Hmm.
show. Um, I think that this play is ripe for that, is ripe for mining the clown material and the fool material, partly because it allows us to accept some of the more unsavory elements of the show if they're put against a backdrop of foolishness. And then characters like Tranio and Biondello, their foolishness and their silliness, in a way, allows us to see how foolish the characters who would otherwise be considered like the straight characters in the show, allows us to see them as being a bit more ridiculous and absurd. Um, Many versions that I have seen of the show play up that clown aspect. There's a very famous production of it, which you can see online, that I have on DVD, that was done, I want to say in 77, maybe earlier. I could have the dates all wrong, but it was a Bill Ball production from ACT in San Francisco, which is all very much commedia dell'arte. There are masks, there are pratfalls, there are characters swinging in on ropes, there's acrobatics and things like that. The wooing scene between Kate and Petruchio is almost a feat of acrobatics in and of itself, with Kate kind of climbing all over Petruchio and him swinging her around, things like that. So many productions play up the clownishness that I've seen. Yeah.
I mean, do you think that there are stumbling blocks to the play being still staged and appreciated today? I think one of the questions that we were talking about with Sean also was like, should you even do the Taming of the Shrew anymore?
Right.
And I wondered if you had thoughts on that question.
Um, I, I, I'm not going to have a great philosophical answer to whether or not we should do it. I will say what's interesting is every time that I see a good production of it, it doesn't necessarily answer the question of why we should do this show, but it sort of says, well, if we can all sit here and really enjoy this thing, then maybe we should keep doing it, you know? So I wish I could give you a better philosophical answer for that, but I do think that there are many stumbling blocks to the show. There are scenes that are hard to palate. Um, you know, I think the two that stand out most clearly to me are the scene when Petruchio is starving Kate, and she, you know, and we're sort of watching this going, wait, is what is actually happening? Is what I think that's happening, is that actually happening? And then I think another thing that's really challenging is when Petruchio shows up late to the wedding, and that can really irk an audience who's worked so hard to enjoy him and excuse him, and then he shows up late to the wedding in such an obnoxious way, and that can be really difficult for an audience to go to lead them into the final moments of the play and Kate's eventual acceptance of Petruchio and their union. So I think that there are many stumbling blocks. Every production tries to address those stumbling blocks in different ways. Some change language, some paint a kind of thick shade of irony over the whole thing. Some encounter it face on and just sort of say and leave it for us to deal with. Uh, I think one thing that I've noticed in many different productions, when I find them be more successful, is when Kate and Petruchio feel like rebels in their own bizarre world. And if that bizarre world has enough definition to it and enough specificity to it, then it allows them to feel like crazy rebels in a very conventional world.
Mm-hmm.
And if that comes across, then it can be a thrilling union at the end with lots of speed bumps along the way, but that there's great potential for us to be rooting for them and for him. If when he I I feel like if when Petruchio speaks without irony, any shade of irony, when he's talking about Kate and being, say, the famous line, the prettiest Kate in Christendom, oftentimes you'll see Petruchio kind of hide behind his cockiness with that
Mhm.
delivery. And I think there's great possibility and potential for him to be just dumbstruck with that
Mhm.
line and not necessarily wearing his cockiness on display, but instead having a moment where he's taken aback. And and those things that are on the page and in the language, if we see that vulnerability begin to creep in very early on, then I think that buys us a lot later. Um, yeah. So to answer your question, there are many stumbling blocks,
Yeah.
uh, but I think there are ways through them, and the ways to go through them, not necessarily around them, but to
Well,
address them.
hearing you talk, just like hearing Shauna talk, it seems like, it's an interesting play because I think you have to approach it with honesty to make this central relationship work. And then there has to be some level of not honesty. I don't want to say not honesty, but heightened theatricality to sort of set the tone for a world which isn't our own and which is the sort of patriarchal world. And are we commenting on the world? So in a way, like you want to comment on the world, but not the central relationship in order to balance those two competing factors of the story that's going on.
Yeah, I do think that the play. I think that we always like to take plays that we're doing and say, see how they relate to right now, uh, and but I do think that not a great deal has necessarily changed. We still have enormous expectations that we put on women in society that we expect them to fulfill, that are sometimes have kind of outrageous um, uh, rules around them, and it is most definitely a society that is heavily rooted in patriarchy, and so I feel like this play has so much to offer us now. If we can paint that world and show that world as the status quo that they're rebelling against, then I think it can reflect back to us our own um, dependence on the patriarchy, and maybe offer us an avenue for rebellion. I don't know.
I like that idea. One of the things that we talk about, especially when we're sort of coming together around the plays as readers, is how do we, as readers, deal with Shakespeare's language, wrestle with it, enjoy it, appreciate it. I'm wondering do you have particular ways that you approach Shakespeare's language as an actor? Is it just sort of second nature to you now you speak English and Shakespeare? Or are there still ways that you specifically wrestle with the language?
Um, I'm I hope everyone will be relieved to hear that I don't speak Shakespeare, uh, except when I'm doing Shakespeare. Um, yeah, I don't greet my son in the morning with a good morrow. Uh, I, I,
I'm sure he'd love it.
yeah, he would. He'd love it now because he's six and in
Does
four
he come and
years.
see you in Shakespeare?
What's
Has,
that?
has he come and seen you in Shakespeare yet?
He has. He's seen quite a bit, and I'm thrilled by it. He's seen a lot. He's seen me in many shows. Love's Labor's Lost. He still talks about because I did a Russian dance in that, and he still is like, "Will you do the Russian dance?" And of course, the answer is no. He saw me get decapitated in Henry VI part one, two, or three. One of them, I was playing Suffolk, and I got my head lopped off, and he saw that on stage. I felt really bad, but he enjoyed it. So yeah, he's seen quite a bit, but
I mean, but back to the question of language, I wonder, does a 6-year-old notice that you're speaking in a different language, or is it just like, oh, you were doing a play and that's how you were talking in that play?
I mean, I wish that I could report that he understood everything, but no,
Of course not.
he's human, and there's much that's lost in him, but there are also many things that he saw. I don't I don't want to talk about what nerds we are, but we are big Shakespeare nerds, and he saw a production of King Lear, and he had big questions, and there were many things that went over his head, but he was utterly dismayed at Gloucester being so heavily tortured by Cornwall and Regan in that show. He was so dismayed by how awful Edmund is to Edgar in that show. Uh, and he was deeply saddened by Cordelia's death at the end, and Lear bringing her in. So like the events of the show and the story was not lost on him.
Mhm.
What was lost on him were, say, the intricate details about, say, Lear dividing up his kingdom and why he's doing that he didn't get. But the big stuff he was most definitely there for.
Mm.
And I think in terms of the language, the language is undoubtedly complicated. And Shrew is full of that. And Shrew has an extra challenge of trying to take 400-year-old jokes and bring them to life.
Mhm.
And if there's anything that is challenging to bring to life, it's topical humor. If you try to watch a comedian that's speaking purely in topical jokes from, say, the 60s or 70s, and a lot's going to be lost on us. Except for the general kind of tone of it. So with me, with Shakespeare, yes, I do have a pretty specific way of dealing with the language. I read the play over and over again, and I read it out loud, and I read it over and over again until first on the most basic level, I just understand what's being said and what's happening. And I read the entire play, everybody's parts, just beginning to end, out loud. After that, I really start focusing on the scenes in which, I have things to do. And then in those scenes, I think about, or I'll read my language over and over again. I think about the different poetic devices that are being used. So, for example, if there's a lot of alliteration, or if there's a lot of heightened metaphor that's being used, if a metaphor is introduced at the beginning of the speech that doesn't pay off until the end of the speech, I think about how that rhetoric is being employed, and then I ask myself, why? Does the character know that he's doing that, or is it just kind of off the cuff? For example, in the balcony speech that Romeo has in Romeo and Juliet, that very famous speech, but soft light through yonder window breaks. It is the east and Juliet is the sun. We have this heightened language, and I feel like Romeo's very aware of it. He's kind of conjuring those images, and it's almost self-conscious, and I feel like that's useful. And then there are other moments, say moments where they might not be aware of their own rhetorical devices. Going back to King Lear with blow winds and crack your cheeks, rage, blow, you cataracts and hurricanes. I don't think that Lear in that moment of madness is necessarily aware of the devices he's employing. He's not aware of the alliteration that's being used. He's not aware of the repeated sounds and the metaphor. I think that he's just kind of giving way to language. So I think about those things. And then I think lastly, once all that work is done and kind of pondered, I think a lot about what the character's doing and what he wants. And, Romeo's not going to give up that play until that last moment, and until he has Juliet on that, in the tomb. He's not going to give up until he has to. And so I'm thinking about what he wants and how to pursue that exact specific thing. Or going back to Shrew with Tranio. Tranio is not going to give up until his kind of friend gets Bianca. He's not going to give up. He's going to commit to this task of pretending to be this wealthy person until it works. And so I think about that, and then rehearsals begin. So that's what I do.
Are there things that tips you would give for readers who are maybe coming to Shakespeare for the first time or picking it up again after a long time to help them get the most out of the experience of reading it?
Yes, for me, reading Shakespeare is thrilling when you read it out loud. This guy is a master of the spoken word. And just the sounds of these words are so exquisite. They're so muscular, they're so visceral. Even when they're not visceral, they're lyrical. It's just a language that is as thrilling to me as hearing a violin, playing. It's exquisite. And so speaking those words out loud over and over again until you get it. And then there's this kind of great feat of accomplishment of having cracked some code. But that's not unique to Shakespeare. That I feel like is the case with all poetry. Poetry is by its nature somewhat coded. It's a language that uses, kind of celebrates code because it's doing an enormous feat. Shakespeare in all poetry is kind of distilling down big thoughts, huge, massive ideas, and is trying to distill them down in the most efficient way possible. Each era has their own way of addressing efficiency, and for Shakespeare it was with iambic pentameter, and to say, with these 10 beats and this specific rhythm, we're going to be able to distill down human nature and human dilemma into a few lines. And that's difficult. It's difficult to unpack that and unlock it. And I think the route to doing that is by saying it out loud and hearing it and celebrating that it is something that is meant to be spoken.
Could we take a minute to talk a little about your book that you've written, just out of fun and curiosity?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. What do you want to know about it?
Tell us about, so the book is called Fat Rascals, yes?
It is,
Where,
yes.
And it is about, will you just tell us what it's about? It's an exploration of food in Shakespeare, is that what it is?
Yeah, it is. It's a cookbook. And I had this nutty idea a few years ago while I was doing a production of Pride and Prejudice in New York, and we were all talking about like things that we wanted to do, other projects that we wanted to do. And one day driving in to do a show, I said, oh, what would be fun is to do this cookbook that's based in Shakespeare. So like you go through the plays and you pull out all the food references and then like make the food in that thing. And then somebody in the back of the car was like, that's a great idea. And everybody else in the car thought it was a terrible idea. But the thinking was that I would go through the plays, 37 plays. Shakespeare talks about food a lot. He names characters after food. He insults characters with references to food. Characters talk about food they're going to eat. Shrew deals with food and specific recipes quite a bit, actually. And so I thought it'd be fun to look into all of those plays, kind of pull the food references, either metaphorical or literal, and pull them from the plays, and then look in these several 400-year-old cookbooks and kind of take recipes for those particular things. So, for example, in Henry IV Part 2, there's this wonderful character, Justice Shallow, who is kind of opining about food that he wants to eat, and he talks about eating he places a menu order to his servant, and he talks about eating a roast joint of mutton, some pretty kickshaws, and a hen, and he talks about that, and I was like, oh well, that sounds great. Let's find a 400-year-old recipe that would be specific to Shakespeare's England for a roast joint of mutton or lamb. So I did that, and then found about 250 recipes. I narrowed it down to about 120, and then I worked and worked and worked, and then created this cookbook, which is here. And it's called Fat Rascals Dining at Shakespeare's Table, and it's legit, and it's in hardback, and people wrote things on the back saying it's good, and then it's got pictures and all kinds of stuff. It's fantastic, and that's my book, and I'm super proud of it, and it just arrived for shipping 2 days ago, and I'm shipping out about 400 orders by Monday, so it's a lot of work.
So, I mean, in general, does the food taste good? Is it weird?
Yeah, no, don't worry. I didn't want to. I cut out all the stuff that doesn't taste good. I don't have a recipe for roast peacock, for example. I didn't want to go that far, and I tested everything. Some things I retested because the initial pass was not very good. But then what surprised me was how good everything is, actually, and how different from our current palate. Right now I would say the typical American palate is just kind of like salty and sweet, and that's about it. And this explores flavor in a way that is very different. They were just introducing sugar into the diet. They were just introducing a lot of spices that came from South Asia. They were introducing the potato. This was the introduction of the potato, was this period. So you have exploring new ingredients, and the food of this time is what I like is that it's unique, it's very distinct, and the recipes that I chose and tested, I think are pretty good. Yeah.
Is there anything you can tell us about food in the Taming of the Shrew?
Yeah,
I mean, he's just starving her, right? There's no food.
Yeah, well, there are many references to food. There's of course the famous starving scene. There's a reference to I think Biondello talks about a stuffed rabbit with parsley. They talk about eating. Kate talks about eating a neat's foot, so like you know, like a goat's foot, basically. Or sorry, a calf's foot, and you have things like that. So I actually wrote down a couple of these references, if you'll indulge me for a second.
Please.
That way I don't have to look like I'm ruminating. I can actually pull up a legit answer. There was oh shoot, they talk about rabbit stuff with parsley, neat's foot, broiled tripe. And then, of course, they talk about beef and the mustard being too hot. What's interesting is mustard is, I think, probably the most quintessential thing of Shakespeare's diet. They talk about mustard in this, they talk about it in As You Like It, and mustard would have been a condiment that every household would have made their own version of. It would have been much hotter than mustards that we are used to now. They talk about mustard in Twelfth Night as being so strong it clears your nose. And so the sort of beef and mustard that's mentioned in Taming of the Shrew would have been, I mean, a celebrated, very common dish, as common as, spaghetti and meatballs would be now. And then, of course, broiled tripe, which is much less common now. But I think it gives an indication to how much Kate is craving it in that scene. One, how hungry she is. And then two, how in Shakespeare's England, everything was used. Things were not being wasted. It's not like now where something's bad in the fridge, you toss it out. It's like that would have been unheard of because these were such prized and expensive items. More than 2/3 of the year was meat-free and dairy-free for religious restrictions. And so those days that you were allowed to actually have things like tripe or a neat's foot, you would have absolutely relished that. And so we don't necessarily eat that now, but Kate would have loved it.
Interesting. Well, something else to read for as people are reading the show. Reading the book. And we're coming kind of to the end of our time. I want to take a few comments here. Please, guys, if you're watching and you have comments, this is your last moment. Squeeze them in. Just an observation, the ACT production in the 70s committee, art type black and white. I think black and white, does he mean perhaps the costumes or the video?
It could have been the filming of it. I don't remember if it was in black and white. But yes, it says, I think Henry Winker was in it. Yeah, Jim Winker. Yes, Jim Winker was in it. Jim Winker played Hortensio in that, and he was fantastic. Yeah.
Bill Ball, many shows at the Old Globe. Classic productions of Hamlet, several classic productions of Hamlet at the Globe. So that's definitely a name that features heavily in the Globe's history.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about the induction, right? That framing story. That's sort of been an ongoing theme in our conversations at the moment about the play. And when I think this is Kim who's asking, did the production of Shrew you were in feature that induction with Christopher Sly? You mentioned it at the beginning when you were first talking about the first production you'd seen, it being like a shocking moment.
Yeah, our production did not feature it at all. We just began with, I want to say, oh gosh, I can't remember now. I want to say we began with Baptista kind of establishing the world, but I know that we cut the Christopher Sly stuff. Every production I've seen of it, though, has had it in, which is unusual because most productions that I hear about it but haven't seen, they cut it. So yeah. I'm sorry to give you that boring of an answer, but no, we did not.
No, not at all. The last question here that I have that I'm going to take is, How are the actors and director working now when they can't rehearse in person? I mean, the sad thing is that they're not.
Right.
I mean, we very much hope that we'll be back in the theater soon, that the actors and director will be able to go into rehearsal, that, you know, we'll be able to get stuff up on stage. But the sad answer is they're not. I mean, unless Shauna is sending you guys stuff to work on in the meantime, I don't think that's how it works. I don't think equity allows it to happen that way.
I mean, it's not. It's totally allowed if we want to communicate. And Shauna and I have talked a little bit. I was doing a show in New York before everything went down, and Shauna and I were talking all through that process, which was great, and had a lot of good phone conversations. Until rehearsals begin, that's mostly what it is, are those phone conversations. But there won't be like a kind of cast get together on Zoom or something where we kind of
anything in particular that you and Shauna were discussing about the play?
We're talking about, because I'm going to play a few different things, playing Biendello and Hortensio and the pedant, that they're sort of a foolish character, a clown, and then the sort of the reveal at the end with the pedant. All of that, we were talking about how, you know, ideas that we had for switching between those characters. How minimal do we want to be with those transitions? How far do we think we can go with those transitions? That kind of stuff. More devices, and not so much themes of the show, but more about how to execute the thing of playing these three different characters, some of whom appear on stage in the same scene simultaneously. You know, so how do we switch back and forth between those two things in a way that is clear to the audience, but also is entertaining for the audience as well.
Well, it seems like a challenge you've been training for since your early days, playing the entire watch in Much Ado About Nothing.
Right. One crazy person.
Well, thank you so much, John, for taking the time to join us. I want to thank everybody who's watching. Please continue to post questions, and we'll have more conversation about this. We very, very much hope we'll have you in the soon.
Fingers crossed. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that this was informative, and I hope that I answered some questions clearly. So thank you.
Definitely. All right. Thank you all. We will be back next week with more conversation about Taming of the Shrew. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.